Margaret Thompson stood at the bus stop with her old leather bag in her hands. The morning air was cold, and she pulled her brown coat tighter around her body. She looked at the paper in her hand for the 10th time. The address was written in her neat handwriting: Metropolitan Music Academy, 1247 5th Street, City Center. The bus arrived with a loud noise and black smoke. Margaret climbed up the steps slowly. Her legs felt heavy, like they were made of stone. She found a seat near the back and sat down carefully. The bus was full of people going to work in the city. They all looked busy and important in their nice clothes. Margaret looked down at her simple floral dress. It was her best dress, but it was 10 years old. She had bought it for her nephew's wedding long ago. The flowers on it were pink and yellow, faded now from many washes. Her black shoes were comfortable but old. She wished she had something newer to wear, something that would make her look like she belonged. She opened her bag and checked inside again. Her audition form was there, folded neatly. She had filled it out so many times before throwing it away. This time she had been brave enough to mail it. When the letter came back saying she could audition, she could not believe it. Margaret Thompson, age 52, librarian from Millbrook, had been accepted to try out at the most famous music school in the state. The bus moved through the countryside. Margaret watched the fields and small houses pass by the window. She thought about her little town of Millbrook. Everyone there knew her as the quiet librarian who worked at the town library for 30 years. They knew her as the woman who never married, who lived alone in the house where she grew up. They knew her as the woman who took care of her sick mother for 23 years until she died. What they did not know was that Margaret had other dreams. Dreams she had kept hidden for so long that sometimes she forgot they were there. Dreams about music, about playing piano in front of people, about sharing the songs that lived in her heart. The bus stopped at a red light. Margaret saw a woman about her age walking with a little girl. The woman looked happy and relaxed. Margaret wondered what it would feel like to be that free, to not care what people thought. She had spent so many years being careful, being quiet, being invisible. She remembered the day she decided to send the audition form. It was 3 months ago, on a Tuesday evening. She had been closing the library when she saw the advertisement in a music magazine that someone had left behind. Open auditions, all ages welcome, it said. She had read it 5 times before she believed it was real. That night she had gone to the old piano in the library's back room. It was out of tune and some keys stuck, but it was the only piano she could use. She had played for 2 hours, her fingers remembering songs she had not touched in years. The music had filled the empty library like a ghost coming back to life. Margaret had learned to play piano when she was 6 years old. Her mother had saved money for lessons, even though they were poor. Margaret had been good, really good. Her teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had said she had a gift. By the time she was 16, she was playing difficult pieces that made people stop and listen, but then everything changed. Her mother got sick when Margaret was 18. The doctors said it was her heart, and she needed someone to take care of her. Margaret was the only child. There was no one else. She had to choose between her music and her family. She chose family. She put away her dreams of music school and big concert halls. She took a job at the library to pay for her mother's medicine. She played piano only late at night, when her mother was sleeping, on the old piano they had at home. Years passed. Her mother got sicker. Margaret learned to give medicine, to cook special food, to help her mother walk. She became good at being a caregiver, but part of her heart stayed empty. The part that needed music. When her mother died 2 years ago, Margaret felt lost. She was 50 years old and had never lived for herself. The house felt too quiet. The library felt too small. She started playing piano again, but only when no one was around to hear. The bus driver called out, "City Center, next stop." Margaret's heart started beating fast. She looked out the window and saw tall buildings and busy streets. Cars honked their horns. People walked quickly on the sidewalks. Everything looked important and serious. She thought about turning around, going back home. Who was she to think she could audition at a famous music school? She was just a small-town librarian with an old dress and a crazy dream. But something inside her, something that had been sleeping for 30 years, whispered, "Try." The bus stopped. Margaret stood up on shaking legs. She walked to the front of the bus and stepped down onto the sidewalk. The city was loud and full of energy. She looked at the paper in her hand again and started walking, the Metropolitan. Music Academy was a beautiful old building made of red brick. It had big windows and stone steps that went up to tall wooden doors. Margaret stood across the street looking at it. Students walked in and out, carrying instrument cases and music books. They all looked young and confident. Margaret crossed the street slowly. Each step felt like a mountain to climb. She went up the stone steps and pushed open the heavy door. Inside, the building was even more beautiful. The walls were covered with pictures of famous musicians. The floor was made of marble that shone. Like a mirror, she found a sign that said, "Auditions, second floor." She climbed the stairs, holding tight to the railing. Her bag felt heavier with each step. On the second floor, she saw a door marked Registration. She stopped and took a deep breath. This was it. This was the moment she had been thinking about for 3 months. Behind that door was her chance to finally try for the dreams she had put away so long ago. Margaret touched the door handle and whispered a little prayer. Then she turned the handle and stepped inside. The room was full of people. Young people, mostly with expensive clothes and confident smiles. They all looked like they belonged there. Margaret felt very small and very old, but she had come too far to turn back now. She walked up to the desk where a young woman was sitting. "I'm here for the audition," Margaret said quietly. "My name is Margaret Thompson." The young woman looked up and smiled. "Welcome to the Metropolitan Music Academy, Mrs. Thompson. Are you ready to begin your audition journey?" Margaret nodded. Even though she felt anything but ready, she was here now. There was no going back. The young woman at the desk gave Margaret a number tag. "Please pin this to your dress," she said. "Number 47. You can wait in the main hall with the other auditioners." Margaret pinned the number to her dress with shaking hands. The number looked so official, so real. She was really doing this. She walked through another door into a large room with high ceilings and long wooden benches. The room was full of people waiting for their turn. Margaret looked around and felt her heart sink. Everyone else looked so young and polished. The girls wore beautiful dresses and had perfect hair. The boys wore nice suits and shiny shoes. They all held expensive music bags and talked in confident voices. Margaret found an empty spot on a bench near the back. She sat down quietly and put her old leather bag on her lap. The bag had been her father's. He had used it to carry his work papers many years ago. Now it held her sheet music and her dreams. A group of young women sat on the bench in front of her. They were all about 20 years old, with long hair and bright smiles. Their dresses looked like they cost more than Margaret made in a month at the library. "I studied at the Williams Conservatory for 3 years, one of them said. Her voice was loud and clear. "My teacher says I have exceptional talent for someone my age." "That's wonderful, Jessica," another girl replied. "I've been playing since I was 4. My parents hired the best teachers money could buy. I've won 12 competitions already." Margaret listened to them talk about their expensive schools and famous teachers. She felt smaller and smaller. What was she doing here? She had learned to play on an old piano in her childhood home. Her teacher had been Mrs. Henderson, who charged $5 a lesson and drank too much coffee. The first girl, Jessica, turned around and noticed Margaret. "Oh, hello there," she said with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Are you here for the audition too?" "Yes," Margaret said quietly. "I am." Jessica looked Margaret up and down, taking in her old dress and worn shoes. "How interesting. And what's your background? Which conservatory did you attend?" Margaret felt her face get hot. I didn't go to a conservatory. I learned in my hometown." The girls exchanged glances. "Oh," Jessica said. "Well, that's single quotes S. Dice. And how old are you, if you don't mind me asking?" I'm 52, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a moment of silence. Then one of the girls let out a small laugh. 52? Really? That's so brave of you. The word brave sounded like foolish the way she said it. Margaret felt tears start to form in her eyes. She looked down at her hands, at her fingers. That had played piano for so many years in secret. I mean, Jessica continued, most people start their professional music careers when they're young. By the time you're 50, isn't it a bit late? Margaret did not know what to say. Maybe they were right? Maybe she was too old, too late, too everything? She thought about the bus ride home, about going back to her quiet life at the library. More people started to notice the conversation. A young man with perfectly styled hair walked over. What are we talking about? He asked. This lady is 52 and she's auditioning, Jessica said with a giggle. Isn't that sweet? The young man looked at Margaret with surprise. 52? Wow, that's really something. Are you sure you're in the right place? Maybe you're looking for the community center? They have programs for older beginners? Margaret felt her cheeks burn. I'm not a beginner, she said softly. Oh, I'm sorry, the young man said, but he did not sound sorry. I just assumed at your age, starting a music career seems a bit unrealistic. More people gathered around now. Margaret felt like she was in a zoo, with everyone staring at the strange old lady who thought she could play piano. She heard whispers and saw people pointing at her. Look at her dress, someone whispered. So old-fashioned. She looks like my grandmother, another person said. This is embarrassing, a girl in a red dress said. Why would someone that old even try? It's kind of sad. Margaret wanted to disappear. She wanted to run out of the building and never come back. But her legs felt too heavy to move. She sat there, holding her father's old bag, feeling like a fool. A boy with a violin case sat down next to her. He was young, maybe 19, with kind eyes. Don't listen to them, he said quietly. Music doesn't have an age limit. Margaret looked at him with surprise. Thank you, she whispered. I'm David, he said. I think it's amazing that you're here. It takes real courage to follow your dreams, no matter when you start. But David's kind words were drowned out by the other voices. Margaret heard Jessica talking to her friends again. Can you imagine? Jessica said. At 52? What's the point? Even if she's good, which I doubt, she's missed her chance. Professional musicians start when they're children. It's actually kind of selfish. Another girl added, she's taking up a spot that could go to someone young, someone who actually has a future in music. Margaret felt like she could not breathe. The room felt too small, too hot. Everyone was looking at her like she was a joke. She thought about her mother, who had always believed in her music. She thought about Mrs. Henderson, who had said she had a gift. But maybe gifts had expiration dates. Maybe hers had expired long ago. A woman with short black hair and expensive jewelry walked up to the group. She looked like she was in her 30s. Probably a teacher or agent. What's all the commotion? She asked. This woman is 52 and she thinks she can audition for the academy, Jessica explained. We were just discussing it. The woman looked at Margaret with raised eyebrows. 52? Oh my. Well, I suppose everyone has the right to dream, but this is a serious institution. We're looking for the next generation of professional musicians. Not hobbyists. Margaret felt something break inside her chest. She was not a hobbyist. She had been playing piano for 46 years. She had sacrificed her dreams for her family. She had played in the dark and secret, keeping her music alive when no one was watching, but she did not say any of this. She just sat there, feeling smaller and smaller, while everyone around her talked about her like she was not there. I heard that some older people audition just for the experience, someone said. Like it's some kind of bucket list thing. That's so inconsiderate, Jessica replied. This is serious business. People like us have worked our whole lives for this opportunity. Margaret looked around the room at all the young faces. They were right about one thing. They had worked their whole lives for this, but so had she. She had just worked quietly, alone in the shadows. The room felt like it was spinning. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to remember why she had come here. She tried to remember the feeling of playing piano late at night in the library, when the music was the only thing that mattered, but all she could hear now were the whispers, and the laughter and the voices telling her she was too old, too late, too foolish to be there. She opened her eyes and looked at the number pinned to her dress, number 47. She wondered if she would have the courage to use it when her turn came. The sound of a door opening made everyone look up. A man in a suit walked out and called, "Number 12, you're up next." Margaret watched as one of the young women walked confidently toward the audition room. She looked so sure of herself, so ready. Margaret touched her number again and wondered if she would ever feel that ready. The whispers continued around her, but now she tried not to listen. She opened her bag and looked at her sheet music. The pages were worn from years of practice. Maybe the music would remember her, even if everyone else thought she did not belong. The audition room door opened and closed many times. Margaret watched as number after number was called. Each time, a young person walked in with confidence and came out looking either very happy or very sad. The waiting room was getting quieter as people left, but Margaret still heard whispers about the old lady who thought she could play. Finally, after what felt like hours, the man in the suit called out, "Number 47. Margaret felt her heart stop. That was her number. She stood up slowly, her legs shaking. The few people still waiting looked up at her with curious eyes. She heard someone whisper, "This should be interesting." Margaret walked toward the audition room, her father's old bag clutched in her hands. Each step felt like walking through deep mud. The man in the suit held the door open for her. He looked at her with a polite but puzzled expression. "Good luck," he said, but his voice sounded like he thought she would need more than luck. Margaret stepped into the audition room and felt her breath catch. The room was large and beautiful, with tall windows that let in bright sunlight. In the center was a grand piano, black and shiny, bigger than any piano she had ever seen. The keys looked perfect, like white and black teeth smiling at her, but it was not the piano that made her nervous. It was the three people sitting behind a long table, watching her with serious faces. These were the judges, the people who would decide if she was good enough. The man in the middle was older, maybe 60, with gray hair and thick glasses. He wore an expensive suit and looked very important. Margaret had seen his picture in the music magazine. This was Dr. Harrison, the head of the Music Academy. He was famous for being very strict and very hard to please. Next to him sat a woman with short red hair and a black dress. She looked like she was in her 40s and had the kind of beauty that came from money and good education. She held a pen and was writing something on a paper. The third judge was a younger man, maybe 35, with dark hair and a friendly face. He was the only one who smiled at Margaret when she walked in, but even his smile looked a little confused. Dr. Harrison looked at Margaret over his glasses. He glanced at the paper in front of him, then back at her. "Margaret Thompson?" he said, and his voice filled the whole room. "Yes, sir," Margaret said quietly. Dr. Harrison looked at her again, taking in her old dress and nervous manner. "Age 52, from Millbrook," he read from the paper. "Occupation, librarian." He paused and looked up at her. "No formal conservatory training listed." Margaret felt her face get hot. "No, sir. I learned from a private teacher in my hometown." The woman with red hair looked up from her writing. "Mrs. Thompson, I have to ask, what made you think you were ready for an audition at this level?" The Metropolitan Music Academy is one of the most prestigious institutions in the country. Margaret did not know what to say. How could she explain? 30 years of playing in secret? How could she tell them about the dreams she had kept hidden while she took care of her mother? I love music," she said finally. "I've been playing piano since I was 6 years old." Dr. Harrison sighed and took off his glasses to clean them. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm sure you understand that love of music, while admirable, is not enough for professional training. Our students typically begin their serious studies in childhood and have extensive backgrounds in competition and performance." The younger judge leaned forward. Have you performed publicly before, Mrs. Thompson? Margaret thought about the question. She had played at her church a few times, many years ago. She had played at her nephew's wedding. But she knew that was not what he meant. Not really, she admitted. I mostly play for myself. The three judges exchanged glances. Margaret saw Dr. Harrison shake his head slightly. The woman with red hair wrote something down and showed it to the other judges. Margaret could not read it, but she could guess what it said. Mrs. Thompson, Dr. Harrison said, and his voice was kind but firm. I appreciate your enthusiasm for music, but I'm concerned that you may not understand what we're looking for here. This is not a community center or a hobby program. We train professional musicians who will go on to perform in major orchestras and concert halls. Margaret felt tears starting to form in her eyes. She had known this would happen. She had known. They would take one look at her and decide she did not belong. I understand, she said softly. Do you? The woman with red hair asked. Because I'm wondering if this audition is really the best use of everyone's time. We have very limited spots, and frankly, we're looking for candidates who can realistically complete our program and build professional careers. The younger judge looked uncomfortable. Well, she's here now, he said. Maybe we should let her. Play something. Dr. Harrison glanced at his watch. I suppose we can give her a few minutes. Mrs. Thompson, what have you prepared for us today? Margaret opened her bag with shaking hands. She pulled out her sheet music, old pages that had been folded and unfolded many times. The paper was yellow, and some of the edges were torn. I prepared Chopin's Nocturne in a flat major, she said. The woman with red hair raised her eyebrows. Chopin? That's quite ambitious. Are you sure you wouldn't prefer something simpler? Perhaps a beginner piece? Margaret felt a flash of anger. She had been playing Chopin for 30 years. She was not a beginner, even if she looked like one. I've been playing this piece for a long time, she said. Her voice a little stronger. Dr. Harrison waved his hand toward the piano. Very well. Please, go ahead. Margaret walked to the piano bench and sat down. The bench was the right height, and the piano was perfectly tuned. She could feel the judges watching her, waiting for her to fail. She put her music on the piano stand, even though she knew the piece by heart. Her hands were shaking as she placed them on the keys. The keys felt smooth and perfect under her fingers. Behind her, she heard Dr. Harrison whisper to the other judges, "This is painful. We should have screening requirements to prevent situations like this." The woman with red hair whispered back, "Poor thing, she probably has no idea how she sounds." Margaret heard every word. She felt her confidence crumble even more. Maybe they were right. Maybe she was fooling herself. Maybe 30 years of playing alone in the dark had made her forget how to play for other people. She looked at the keys and tried to remember why she had come here. She tried to remember the feeling of music flowing through her fingers late at night in the library. But all she could think about were the whispers and the stares and the certainty that she was about to embarrass herself in front of these important people. The room was completely quiet now. Margaret could hear the clock on the wall ticking. She could hear cars passing by outside the window. She could hear her own heart beating so loud she was sure everyone else could hear it too. Double quotes, Mrs. Thompson, Dr. Harrison said impatiently. Are you going to play? Margaret closed her eyes and took a deep breath. This was it. This was the moment she had been dreaming about for 30 years. She thought about her mother, who had always believed in her music. She thought about Mrs. Henderson, who had said she had a gift. She thought about all the nights she had played in the dark, keeping her dreams alive. Maybe she was too old. Maybe she was too late. Maybe she did not belong here. But she had come too far to give up now. Margaret opened her eyes and looked at the piano keys. For a moment, everything else disappeared. The judges, the whispers, the fear, it all faded away. There was only Margaret and the piano, and the music that had been waiting inside her for so long. She raised her hands and prepared to play. This was her moment. This was her chance to show them who she really was, not the quiet librarian they saw, but the musician she had always been inside. The room held its breath, waiting to see what would happen when Margaret Thompson finally let her music free. Margaret's fingers touched the keys, and for a moment nothing happened. The silence in the room was so thick it felt like a heavy blanket. She could feel the judges waiting, probably expecting her to stumble through a simple melody like a child. At her first recital, then, something changed. The first note came out soft and gentle, like a whisper. It was the beginning of Chopin's Nocturne, a piece that Margaret had played thousands of times in the quiet darkness of the library. But this time was different. This time she was not hiding. The second note followed, then the third. Margaret's hands began to remember what they were made for. 30 years of secret practice, 30 years of playing for no one but herself, had not been wasted. Her fingers found their way across the keys like they were coming home. Behind her, Dr. Harrison stopped writing and looked up. The woman with red hair put down her pen. The younger judge leaned forward in his chair. Something in the air had changed, something they had not expected. Margaret did not notice their reactions. She was lost in the music now, in the place where she had always felt most like herself. The piano was perfect, better than any instrument she had ever played. Each key responded to her touch like it was waiting for her. The sound that came out was rich and full, filling the room with beauty. The melody began to grow. What had started as a whisper became a song. Margaret's left hand played the deep bass notes while her right hand danced across the higher keys. The music flowed like water, smooth and natural, as if it had always been meant to happen this way. Dr. Harrison blinked and looked at his fellow judges. This was not what he had expected. The woman sitting at the piano, the one in the old dress, with the nervous smile, was playing with skill that surprised him. This was not the amateur performance he had prepared himself for. The music continued to build. Margaret's body began to move with the melody, swaying slightly as her hands moved across the keys. She was not thinking about technique or perfection. She was just playing the way she had always played, with her whole heart. The woman with red hair felt something stir in her chest. She had heard this piece played by students many times, but never like this. There was something different about Margaret's playing, something that went beyond technical skill. There was emotion in every note. Feeling that came from somewhere deep inside. Margaret's hands moved faster now, playing the more complex part of the piece. Her fingers flew across the keys with surprising speed and accuracy. The judges could see that she was not struggling with the music. She knew it completely, had made it part of herself. The younger judge felt his mouth fall open slightly. He had been ready to feel sorry for this older woman, to sit politely through a difficult performance. But what he was hearing was not difficult to listen to. It was beautiful, Margaret played on, unaware of the change happening behind her. In her mind, she was not in the audition room anymore. She was in the library late at night, playing for her own joy. She was 18 years old again, playing for her mother before everything changed. She was every age she had ever been, every moment she had ever touched a piano. The music grew louder, more confident. Margaret's whole body was involved now, her shoulders moving, her head nodding slightly with the rhythm. This was how she had always played when no one was watching, with complete freedom and joy. Dr. Harrison found himself leaning forward. He had been teaching and judging music for 30 years. He had heard thousands of students play this same piece. But there was something about Margaret's interpretation that was different. She was not just playing the notes. She was telling a story. The story was about longing, about dreams that had been put away but never forgotten. It was about love and loss and hope. It was about a woman who had given up her music for her family, but had never stopped being a musician in her heart. The woman with red hair felt tears forming in her eyes. She tried to blink them away, surprised by her own reaction. She was supposed to be judging technique and training, not getting emotional. But Margaret's playing was reaching something inside her that she had forgotten existed. Margaret's left hand played a deep, sad melody while her right hand added delicate touches above it. The two parts of the music talked to each other like old friends. This was the part of the piece that Margaret loved most, where Chopin showed both the beauty and the sadness of life. The younger judge realized he was holding his breath. He had never heard anyone play with such pure emotion. Margaret, was not trying to impress anyone. She was not showing off. She was just sharing her music, the way someone might share a precious gift. The room seemed to shimmer with the sound of the piano. The afternoon sunlight coming through the windows made everything look golden and beautiful. Margaret's hands moved across the keys like they were painting a picture with sound. Dr. Harrison felt something he had not felt in years. When he first started teaching, he had believed that music was about more than just skill and training. He had believed it was about touching people's hearts. Somewhere along the way, he had forgotten that. But Margaret's playing was reminding him. The music began to slow down, approaching the end of the piece. Margaret's hands moved more gently. Now, playing the final melody with the tenderness of a mother singing a lullaby. Each note was perfect, placed exactly where it needed to be. The woman with red hair realized she was crying. Real tears were running down her cheeks. She had not cried at a musical performance in 10 years. But something about Margaret's playing had broken through all her professional barriers and reached the part of her that still loved music for its own sake. Margaret played the last few notes with infinite care. Each one hung in the air like a jewel before fading away. The melody grew softer and softer until it was almost gone. Then, with a final gentle touch, Margaret played the last note. The note faded into silence. Margaret's hands remained on the keys for a moment, as if she did not want to let go. Then she lifted them and placed them in her lap. She sat very still, looking at the piano. Not yet, ready to turn around and face the judges? Behind her, the room was completely quiet. The 3 judges sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just heard. This was not the performance they had expected from the nervous, older woman in the simple dress. Dr. Harrison stared at Margaret's back, his mouth slightly open. In 30 years of teaching, he had rarely heard anyone play with such deep feeling. The technical skill was impressive, yes, but it was more than that. Margaret had played like someone who truly understood the music, who had lived with it and made it part of her soul. The woman with red hair wiped her eyes with a tissue, trying to compose herself. She looked at her notes, at all the critical comments she had been prepared to write. None of them seemed to matter now. The younger judge felt like he had just witnessed something magical. This was why he had become involved in music in the first place. Moments like this, when someone's playing could transport you to another world. Margaret finally turned around to face the judges. She expected to see polite smiles and gentle rejection. Instead, she saw 3 faces that looked completely different from when she had sat down. Dr. Harrison was staring at her with wide eyes. The woman with red hair was wiping tears from her cheeks. The younger judge was shaking his head in amazement. Margaret started to say, but her voice came out as a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. Thank you for listening, Doctor. Harrison continued to stare at her. The room remained silent, as if everyone was afraid to break the spell that Margaret's music had created. Finally, he spoke. Mrs. Thompson, he said, and his voice was completely different from before. That was extraordinary. Margaret sat on the piano bench, looking at Dr. Harrison with confusion. She had expected him to thank her politely and send her home. Instead, he was staring at her like he had seen a ghost. Extraordinary? Margaret repeated, her voice uncertain. The woman with red hair was still wiping her eyes. She looked at Margaret with a completely different expression than before. Mrs. Thompson, where did you learn to play like that? Margaret felt her heart beating fast. Something had changed in the room, but she did not understand what. I told you. I learned from Mrs. Henderson in my hometown, and I've been practicing on my own. For how long? The younger judge asked, leaning forward. Since I was 6, Margaret said. That's 46 years. Dr. Harrison stood up from his chair and walked around the table. He came closer to Margaret, studying her face like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Mrs. Thompson, that performance was not the work of a casual player. You have exceptional technical skill, but more than that, you have something that cannot be taught. Margaret did not know what to say. She had expected rejection, criticism, maybe even laughter. But Dr. Harrison sounded serious, almost excited. What do you mean? She asked. You have musical soul, the woman with red hair said, her voice soft with emotion. I've been teaching for 15 years, and I've heard thousands of students play that piece, but you made me feel things I had forgotten I could feel. Margaret looked around the room in amazement. These important people, these judges who had seemed so cold and critical, were looking at her with respect. With admiration, even. I don't understand, Margaret said. A few minutes ago, you were ready to send me home without even listening. Dr. Harrison had the grace to look embarrassed. Mrs. Thompson, I owe you an apology. I made assumptions based on your age and background. That was wrong of me, and I'm sorry. We all did, the younger judge added. We thought we knew what to expect. We were completely wrong. Margaret felt tears starting to form in her eyes, but this time they were different tears. Not tears of shame or embarrassment, but tears of relief and joy. For the first time in 30 years, someone was recognizing her music for what it truly was. Mrs. Thompson, Dr. Harrison said, sitting down in the chair next to the piano, I need to ask you something important. You said you've been practicing on your own all these years. Where? How? Margaret took a deep breath. At the library where I work. There's an old piano in the back room. I stay after hours and play. The piano is out of tune and some keys stick, but it's the only place I can practice. The woman with red hair looked shocked. You've been maintaining that level of skill on a broken piano? It's not broken, Margaret said quickly. Just old. Like me, Mrs. Thompson, the younger judge said gently, you're not old in your playing. When you play, you become timeless. Margaret felt her heart swell. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. For so many years, she had thought her music was just a private hobby, something she did for herself in the dark. Dr. Harrison leaned forward. Mrs. Thompson, I have to ask, why now? Why did you decide to audition after all these years? Margaret was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to explain. My mother died 2 years ago. I took care of her for 23 years. She was sick, and I was all she had. I gave up my dreams of music school to take care of her. That's a big sacrifice, the woman with red hair said softly. It didn't feel like a sacrifice then, Margaret said. She was my mother. I loved her. But after she died, I felt lost, empty. I had spent so many years taking care of someone else that I forgot how to take care of myself. The only thing that made me feel alive was playing piano. She paused, remembering those dark months after her mother's funeral. One night, I was playing in the library and I realized that I had been hiding my music for 30 years. I had been hiding myself. I saw the audition advertisement and thought, maybe it's not too late. Maybe I still have time to try for my dreams. Dr. Harrison nodded slowly. And your dreams? What are they now? Margaret looked at her hands. I don't know. Anymore. For so long, I dreamed of playing in concert halls, of sharing my music with people. But I'm 52. I know that's not realistic now. Why not? The younger judge asked. Margaret looked at him in surprise. Because I'm too old. Because I missed my chance. Because people like you don't take people like me seriously? People like you? Dr. Harrison repeated. Mrs. Thompson, do you know what kind of person you are? Margaret shook her head. You're a person with extraordinary musical talent, who has kept that talent alive through 30 years of hardship and sacrifice. You're a person who can make 3 professional musicians cry with a single performance. You're a person who has something very rare, the ability to touch people's hearts with music. Margaret felt like she was in a dream. But I'm 52, she whispered. So what? The woman with red hair said, her voice strong. Grandma Moses didn't start painting until she was 78. Julia Child didn't write her first cookbook until she was 50. Age is just a number when you have real talent. But the music world is different, Margaret said. Everyone starts young. Everyone starts young because that's the way it's always been done, Dr. Harrison said. But maybe it's time to change that. Maybe the music world needs someone like you. Margaret felt dizzy. Was this really happening? Were these important people really talking to her about a future in music? What are you saying? she asked. Doctor. Harrison exchanged glances with the other judges. They seemed to have a silent conversation with their eyes. Finally, he turned back to Margaret. Mrs. Thompson, we would like to offer you a place in our advanced program. Margaret's mouth fell open. What? You heard correctly, the woman with red hair said with a smile. We want you to study here, but I thought this was just an audition to see if I was good enough for basic classes. The advanced program is for our most talented students, the younger judge explained. Students who we believe have the potential for professional careers. Margaret felt like she could not breathe. A professional career at my age? Mrs. Thompson, Dr. Harrison said, standing up again. Let me tell you something. I've been in music education for 30 years. I've taught students who went on to play with the New York Philharmonic, students who became famous soloists, students who won international competitions. But I have rarely heard anyone play with the depth of feeling that you just showed us. You have a gift? The woman with red hair added. A real gift. It would be a crime to waste it. Margaret looked around the room, trying to make sense of what was happening. An hour ago, she had been the object of ridicule and pity. Now, these same people were offering her a chance at the dreams she had thought were lost forever. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Say yes, the younger judge said with a grin. Margaret felt tears running down her cheeks. Happy tears this time, tears of joy and amazement and hope. Yes, she said, her voice growing stronger. Yes, I would love to study here. Dr. Harrison smiled, and for the first time, Margaret saw warmth in his eyes. Welcome to the Metropolitan Music Academy, Mrs. Thompson. I have a feeling you're going to change this place as much as it changes you. Margaret looked at the piano, the beautiful instrument that had helped her show the world who she really was. For 30 years, she had hidden her light under a bushel. Today, she had finally let it shine, and the world had noticed. Margaret walked out of the audition room feeling like she was floating on air. Her legs felt weak, but her heart felt stronger than it had in years. She held the acceptance letter in her hands, reading it over and over to make sure it was real. Congratulations on your acceptance to the Metropolitan Music Academy Advanced Program, it said in formal letters. Below that, Dr. Harrison had written a personal note. Mrs. Thompson, we are honored to have you join our musical family. Your talent is extraordinary. As Margaret entered the waiting room, she saw that only a few people were left. Most of the young auditioners had already finished and gone home. The ones who remained looked up when she walked in, curious about what had taken so long. Jessica, the young woman who had been so cruel earlier, was still there with two of her friends. She looked at Margaret with raised eyebrows. You were in there for a long time, she said. Did they have trouble figuring out how to let you down gently? Margaret looked at Jessica and felt something she had never felt before. Confidence. Real confidence, not just the fake kind that people put on to hide their fear. Actually, Margaret said quietly, they offered me a place in the advanced program. Jessica's face went blank. What? I've been accepted? Margaret said, her voice growing stronger. I start classes next month. The small group of remaining auditioners stared at Margaret in shock. Jessica's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. One of her friends laughed nervously. That's impossible, Jessica said. They don't accept people like, people who ... People like me? Margaret asked, and for the first time in her life, she was not ashamed of who she was. David, the kind young man with the violin, walked over with a big smile. That's amazing. Congratulations. I knew they would see your talent. Thank you, David, Margaret said. How did your audition go? I got into the basic program, he said happily. I'm so excited, but advanced program, that's incredible. Only the very best students get into that. Jessica stood up quickly, her face red with embarrassment and anger. This is ridiculous. There must be some mistake. They can't possibly have accepted her overqualified young musicians. Margaret looked at Jessica with pity instead of hurt. Jessica, there's room for all kinds of musicians in this world. Music isn't about age or how you look. It's about what's in your heart. Jessica. stormed out of the room with her friends following behind her. Margaret heard her complaining loudly in the hallway about unfair decisions and political correctness gone too far. Margaret sat down next to David, feeling suddenly exhausted. The excitement and stress of the day was catching up with her. No, David said thoughtfully. I heard your performance through the walls. Everyone did. You made people stop and listen? That's a rare gift, Margaret smiled at him. Thank you. You're very kind. I'm not being kind, David said seriously. I'm being honest. I've been studying music for 15 years, and I've never heard anything like what you played in there. As they talked, Margaret began to understand what had really happened in the audition room. It was not just that she had played well. She had played with something that came from deep inside her, something that had been growing and developing. For 30 years in secret, all those nights in the library, playing alone on the old piano, had not been wasted time. They had been preparation. Every sad song she had played after a hard day, every joyful melody she had discovered, every moment of beauty she had created in the darkness, it had all been leading to this moment. Margaret thought about her childhood, about the little girl who had first touched piano keys and felt magic. That little girl had dreamed of sharing her music with the world. But life had gotten in the way, as life often does. Her mother had gotten sick, and dreams had to be put aside for love and duty, but the dreams had never died. They had just gone underground, like seeds waiting for spring. For 30 years, Margaret had watered those seeds with her nighttime playing, with her secret practice, with her refusal to let go of the music that lived inside her. When her mother died, Margaret had felt lost and empty. She had given so much of herself to caring for another person that she had forgotten who she was underneath. But the music had reminded her. The music had been her way back to herself. Margaret remembered the first time she had played after her mother's funeral. She had sat at the old piano in the library and put her hands on the keys, not knowing what would come out. What had come out was pain, but also beauty, sadness, but also hope. It was then that she realized her music had grown deeper and richer. Because of everything she had experienced, the young musicians around her had talent and training, but they had not yet lived through real heartbreak and sacrifice. They had not yet learned that the most beautiful music comes from the places that hurt the most. Margaret's music was full of life because she had lived it fully, with all its joys and sorrows. David looked at his watch. I should go. My parents are picking me up, he turned to Margaret. I hope I'll see you around the academy. Maybe you could give me some advice sometime, Margaret laughed. You want advice from me? Yes, David said seriously. You have something I want to learn. You play like you've discovered a secret that the rest of us don't know yet. After David left, Margaret sat alone in the quiet waiting room. She looked around at the elegant space, with its high ceilings and expensive furniture. This morning it had felt like a place where she did not belong. Now it felt like home. Margaret opened her bag and looked at the sheet music inside. These worn pages had been her companions for so many years. They had traveled with her from her childhood home to her mother's bedside to the library where she worked. Now they would travel with her to a new adventure. She thought about what she would tell people back in Millbrook. For 30 years, she had been Margaret the librarian, Margaret the spinster, Margaret the woman who had never married and never done anything interesting. Now she would be Margaret the music student, Margaret the woman who had surprised everyone, including herself, but most importantly, she would be Margaret the musician. That was who she had always been, deep down inside. Everything else had been just the costume she wore while waiting for her real life to begin. Margaret stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the city was busy with afternoon traffic and people hurrying to their destinations. She watched them and wondered how many of them had dreams they had put aside, talents they had hidden, songs they had never sung. She thought about all the Margaret Thompsons out there in the world, people who had convinced themselves it was too late, people who had accepted that their dreams were impossible, people who had forgotten that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. Margaret touched the acceptance letter in her bag one more time. Tomorrow she would call the library. and give her resignation. She would pack up her mother's house and move to the city. She would start over at 52, scary as that was, but for the first time in 30 years, Margaret was not afraid. She had found her courage in the music, and the music would carry her forward. She had discovered that dreams don't die, they just wait patiently for the right moment to bloom. Margaret walked out of the Metropolitan Music Academy and into the afternoon sunshine. She had entered the building as one person and was leaving as another. The woman walking down the steps was the same Margaret Thompson, but she was also completely different. She was Margaret Thompson, musician, and her new life was just beginning. Margaret stood outside the Metropolitan Music Academy, holding her acceptance letter and looking up at the beautiful building that would soon become her second home. The afternoon sun made the red brick walls glow like fire. She could hardly believe this was really happening. A group of people walked past her, some of the young auditioners who were leaving for the day. She heard Jessica's voice among them, still complaining loudly. "It's totally unfair," Jessica was saying to her friends. They obviously felt sorry for her because she's old. "It's charity, not merit. She probably can't even read music properly." Margaret felt a moment of doubt creep into her mind. Maybe Jessica was right. Maybe the judges had just felt bad for her and made a mistake. But then she remembered the look on Dr. Harrison's face when she finished playing, the tears in the woman's eyes, the amazement of the younger judge. That had not been pity. That had been recognition. As Margaret was lost in thought, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned around and saw Dr. Harrison walking out of the building with a man she did not recognize, an older gentleman with silver hair and an expensive suit. "Mrs. Thompson?" Dr. Harrison called out when he saw her. "Perfect timing. I'd like you to meet someone very important." Margaret felt nervous as the two men approached her. Dr. Harrison was smiling, but she still could not quite believe that her audition had gone as well as it seemed. "Mrs. Thompson, this is Mr. Robert Sterling, chairman of the Academy's board of directors," Dr. Harrison said. "Robert, this is the woman I was telling you about." Mr. Sterling looked at Margaret with curious eyes and extended his hand. "Mrs. Thompson, Dr. Harrison has been telling me extraordinary things about your audition today. He says you gave one of the most moving performances he's heard in 30 years of teaching." Margaret shook his hand, feeling overwhelmed. "He's very kind, but I'm sure he's exaggerating." "No, I'm not," Dr. Harrison said firmly. "Robert, you should have heard her play Chopin. It was like like hearing the music for the first time." Mr. Sterling studied Margaret's face. "Mrs. Thompson, would you mind if I asked you a personal question?" "Of course not," Margaret replied, though she felt nervous about what he might ask. "Dr. Harrison tells me you've been caring for your sick mother for over 20 years, and that you've been practicing piano alone all this time. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir," Margaret said quietly. Mr. Sterling nodded slowly. "My own mother died 5 years ago after a long illness. I was her primary caregiver for the last 3 years of her life. I know how difficult that can be, how much sacrifice it requires." Margaret felt tears forming in her eyes. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you. But what I want to say is this. The fact that you kept your music alive during those years of caregiving tells me something very important about who you are as a person. It tells me you have strength and dedication that go far beyond musical talent." Margaret did not know what to say. She had never thought of her situation that way before. Dr. Harrison stepped forward. "Mrs. Thompson, Mr. Sterling and I have been discussing your acceptance into our program. We want to offer you something special." "Special?" Margaret asked. "We'd like to offer you a full scholarship," Mr. Sterling said. "Complete tuition, plus a living allowance to help you relocate to the city." Margaret felt the world spin around her. "A scholarship? But I haven't done anything to earn it." "You've done 30 years of things to earn it," Dr. Harrison said. "Mrs. Thompson, talent like yours is rare. But talent combined with the life experience and depth of feeling that you bring, that's extraordinary." Margaret looked back and forth between the two men, trying to process what they were telling her. I don't understand why you're being so generous to me. Mr. Sterling smiled. Mrs. Thompson, this academy was founded on the belief that music has the power to change lives and touch hearts. Today, your music touched our hearts. Now, we want to help your music reach the world. Just then, another group of people came out of the building. Margaret recognized some of them as students and faculty she had seen earlier. But there were others, too. People with cameras and notepads who looked like reporters. "Dr. Harrison," one of the reporters called out. We heard. There was an unusual audition today. Something about an older student who impressed the judges? Dr. Harrison looked at Margaret. "Mrs. Thompson, it seems word is already getting out about your performance. Would you be comfortable speaking to the press?" Margaret felt panic rise in her chest. I'm not good with reporters. I'm just a librarian from a small town." "You're not just anything," Mr. Sterling said kindly. "But you don't have to talk to them if you don't want to. It's completely your choice." Margaret looked at the group of reporters gathering nearby. She could hear them talking excitedly about a feel-good story and an unlikely musical discovery. Part of her wanted to run away and hide like she had been doing her whole life, but another part of her thought about all the people like her, people who had given up on their dreams, people who thought it was too late to change their lives. Maybe her story could help them believe in themselves again. "I'll talk to them," Margaret said quietly. The reporters gathered around her, cameras flashing and microphones pointed in her direction. Margaret felt overwhelmed by all the attention, but she tried to answer their questions honestly. "Mrs. Thompson, how does it feel to be accepted into one of the most prestigious music programs in the country at age 52? One reporter asked. "It feels like a miracle," Margaret said simply. "I had given up on this dream a long time ago." "What made you decide to audition now?" Another reporter asked. Margaret thought about the question. "When my mother died, I realized I had been living for everyone except myself. Music was the only thing that made me feel alive, so I decided to take a chance." What would you say to other people who think they're too old to pursue their dreams? A young female reporter asked. Margaret looked directly into the camera. "I would say that dreams don't have expiration dates. I would say that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. I spent 30 years thinking my chance had passed, but I was wrong. Sometimes the best time to start is when you think it's too late." The reporters asked many more questions, but Margaret remembered that last one the most clearly. As she spoke those words, she realized she was not just giving advice to other people. She was making a promise to herself. After the reporters left, Dr. Harrison and Mr. Sterling walked Margaret to the bus stop. The evening was getting cool, and the city lights were starting to come on. "Mrs. Thompson," Dr. Harrison said as they waited for her bus, "I want you to know that having you in our program is going to be good for all of us. You're going to teach our young students things they can't learn from textbooks." "What kinds of things?" Margaret asked. "You're going to teach them that music comes from life, not just from practice rooms. You're going to show them that the most beautiful performances come from the heart, not just from perfect technique." The bus arrived and Margaret climbed aboard. As it pulled away from the curb, she looked back at the two men waving goodbye. In a few weeks she would be back, not as a nervous auditioner, but as a student beginning a new chapter of her life. Margaret found a seat and opened her bag to look at her acceptance letter one more time. But folded inside it, she found something else. A note from Dr. Harrison that she had not noticed before. "Mrs. Thompson," it read, "thank you for reminding us why we became musicians in the first place. Your performance today was not just an audition, it was a gift. We are honored to be part of your musical journey." Margaret smiled and looked out the window as the bus carried her away from the city and back toward Millbrook. Tomorrow, she would start making plans to change her entire life. But tonight, she just wanted to sit quietly and feel proud of herself for the first time in 30 years. She had done something brave today. She had taken a chance on herself, and it had paid off in ways she never could have imagined. Margaret Thompson, the quiet librarian, was gone. In her place was Margaret Thompson, the musician ready to share her gift with the world. 6 months later, Margaret stood backstage at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., wearing a beautiful black evening gown that the Academy had helped her choose. Her hair was styled elegantly, and she wore the pearl necklace that had belonged to her mother. She looked like a completely different person from the nervous woman who had walked into that audition room half a year ago, but inside, her heart was beating just as fast as it had that day. 5 minutes, Mrs. Thompson, the stage manager whispered to her. Are you ready? Margaret nodded, though she was not sure she would ever feel ready for this moment. She was about to perform as a soloist with the National Symphony Orchestra in front of 2,000 people. The concert was being broadcast live on television to millions more. The story of Margaret's audition had spread far beyond the Music Academy. Videos of her playing had been shared millions of times on social media. News programs had featured her story. People from around the world had written to her, telling her how her courage had inspired them to pursue their own delayed dreams. But Margaret tried not to think about all the people watching. Instead, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. The first months at the Academy had been challenging. Margaret had to learn to live in the city, to navigate crowded streets and busy subways. She had to adjust to being around young students who were sometimes amazed by her presence and sometimes resentful of the attention she received, but Dr. Harrison and the other faculty had supported her every step of the way. They had given her private lessons to help her catch up on some of the technical training she had missed. More importantly, they had encouraged her to trust her own musical instincts, the ones that had been developing in secret for 30 years. Margaret had also learned to teach. The Academy had asked her to work with some of their younger students, sharing not just her musical knowledge but her life experience. She had discovered that she loved helping young musicians understand that technique was important, but heart was essential. One of her favorite students was David, the kind young man she had met on audition day. He had become like a son to her, and she had helped him learn to play with more emotion and feeling. In return, he had taught her about technology, helping her set up social media accounts and connect with the people who had been inspired by her story. But the most surprising development had been the recognition from the professional music world. After videos of her playing went viral, she had received invitations to perform with orchestras around the country. Recording companies had contacted her about making albums. Music magazines had written articles about her unconventional path to success. Margaret had been careful not to let the attention go to her head. She remembered where she came from, remembered the 30 years of quiet practice that had prepared her for this moment. She still thought of herself as Margaret the librarian who happened to play piano beautifully. 2 minutes, Mrs. Thompson. The stage manager whispered. Margaret walked to the edge of the stage and peered out at the audience. The Kennedy Center Concert Hall was magnificent, with red velvet seats rising up in elegant tiers. Every seat was filled. She could see people of all ages, young music students, older adults who looked like they might have their own deferred dreams, families who had come to witness something special. In the front row, she spotted some familiar faces. Dr. Harrison was there, beaming with pride. Mr. Sterling sat next to him. David had driven down from the Academy with some of her other students. Even Mrs. Patterson, the head librarian from Millbrook, had made the trip to see her former colleague's debut. Margaret thought about her mother, who had always believed in her music even when Margaret herself had stopped believing. She wished her mother could be there to see this moment, but she felt her presence anyway. All those years of sacrifice had led to this. Mrs. Thompson, you're on, the stage manager said softly. Margaret walked onto the stage, her heels clicking on the polished floor. The audience erupted in applause before she had even reached the piano. She smiled and waved, still amazed by the warmth of people's response to her story. The conductor, a distinguished man named Maestro Rodriguez, approached her and shook her hand. Are you ready to make some beautiful music, Mrs. Thompson? He asked with a smile. I've been ready for 30 years, Margaret replied. She sat down at the grand piano, the most beautiful instrument she had ever played. The orchestra musicians, all world-class players, looked at her with respect and anticipation. 6 months ago, some of them might have been skeptical about performing with a newcomer, but they had heard the recordings of her playing, and they knew they were in the presence of real talent. Margaret placed her hands on the keys and looked out at the audience one more time. The concert hall was completely silent, 2,000 people holding their breath and waiting for her to begin. She was going to play the same piece that had changed her life, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. But tonight she would play it with a full orchestra, arrangements specially written for this concert. The piece that had been her secret companion for so many years would now be shared with the world. Margaret closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She thought about the little girl who had first fallen in love with piano music. She thought about the young woman who had put her dreams aside for love and duty. She thought about the middle-aged librarian who had kept those dreams alive in the darkness. All of those versions of herself had led to this moment. She began to play. The first notes floated out over the silent audience, gentle and pure. But this time, Margaret was not playing alone. The orchestra joined her, strings and woodwinds weaving a beautiful tapestry of sound around her melody. The music filled the huge concert hall, reaching every corner, touching every heart. As Margaret played, she felt herself transform once again. She was not thinking about the cameras or the audience or the pressure. She was just sharing her music, the way she had always done, with complete honesty and love. The audience was mesmerized. People in the balcony leaned forward in their seats. In the front row, she could see Dr. Harrison wiping his eyes. David was recording the performance on his phone, but tears were streaming down his face. Margaret played the beautiful, complex passages with ease, her fingers dancing across the keys like they were greeting old friends. The orchestra followed, her lead responding to every subtle change in her interpretation. This was what she had always dreamed of, making music with other musicians, sharing the joy and beauty that lived inside the notes. As the piece built to its climax, Margaret felt a sense of completion that she had never experienced before. This was not just a performance. It was the fulfillment of a lifetime of hope and work and patience. Every hour she had spent practicing alone had been leading to this moment of connection with thousands of other people. The final notes faded into the vast space of the concert hall, and for a moment there was complete silence. Then the audience exploded into applause that went on for nearly 10 minutes. People stood up, tears streaming down their faces, clapping until their hands hurt. Margaret stood up from the piano bench and curtsied to the audience, overwhelmed by their response. The orchestra musicians were applauding too, many of them standing to honor her performance. As the applause continued, Margaret looked out at all the faces in the audience. She saw young people who looked inspired, older people who looked hopeful, and families who looked proud to be witnessing this moment. She realized that her music had done more than entertain them. It had reminded them that beautiful things are possible, even when they seem impossible. Later that evening, at the reception after the concert, Margaret was surrounded by well-wishers and reporters. But the conversation that meant the most to her was with a woman about her own age who approached her nervously. "Mrs. Thompson," the woman said, "I wanted to thank you. I'm 55, and I used to paint when I was young. I gave it up when I got married and had children, but watching you tonight, you've inspired me to pick up my brushes again." Margaret smiled and took the woman's hands. "It's never too late," she said. "I'm living proof of that." As the evening wound down, Margaret found herself standing alone for a moment, looking out at the city lights through the windows of the Kennedy Center. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from a small-town library to one of the most prestigious concert halls in the world, but she knew this was not an ending. It was a beginning. There would be more concerts, more recordings, more opportunities to share her music and her story. And there would be more students to teach, more people to inspire, more chances to prove that dreams don't have expiration dates. Margaret Thompson had spent the first 52 years of her life learning how to live for others. Now she was spending the rest of her life learning how to live for herself. And in doing so, she was teaching the world that It's never too late to become who you were meant to be. She had found her voice at last, and the world was listening.